Hello.
How you doing?
How are you?
Good.
Today?
This is on time, so we really took you. Stay in the area. I was very impressed. And I wonder how many people realize, I think they know scat. Always kind of exclusion. They're actually gonna go to the. Only gonna go Thursday. But I'm gonna go to the Thursday day. Yeah, by the way, you going to that? Are you? Well, you'll see me Thursday all day.
They're saying hello.
That's too bad. Unless you work it, so yeah. Good to see you. I think there's a lot of things that getting back so good and thinking about really different things. Just below the surface.
Kids would want to. Well, they're not kids anymore. And at the time, I was at that time, it didn't come down through the.
We were second.
Can you imagine? Later.
If you haven't noticed by now, she's not a bird, she's a bird.
Yeah, well, I feel like I'm on TV. I was told that if I stood right here, the microphone would pick me up and the camera would as well. That's why I put the spot on the carpet. That's right. No, that's why we're renovating the auditorium, so we don't put new carpet down. But it's time for us to get started tonight, and I want to welcome you all to come to this edition of the Evening Skidaway lecture series. We're very pleased with the number of people that are here tonight. We appreciate you coming. And I just want to mention that we have a friends group called the Associates of Skidaway Institute, that if you're interested in supporting these kinds of activities, these little receptions, we have our most recent newsletter is up here. If you become a member, we mail out the newsletter twice a year. We have also every other quarter, we have an e-newsletter that goes out. And please, we have the most current issue is here. And around the corner, we have a couple older issues if you haven't picked them up before and you're interested in reading about things that have gone on at the campus and the research that our faculty are doing. I'll also mention that if you're interested in getting announcements for these events and those sorts of things without joining our friends group, please make sure you sign up on the sheet there as well. All we really need is a name and an email address, and we'll be happy to include you in all the announcements that come out about our activities here on campus. But we do want to thank you for coming here tonight. We are very pleased to welcome Althea Moore, Dr. Althea Moore, who is currently a postdoctoral scientist here at the Skidaway Institute. She started with a bachelor's in Earlham College, which is in Richmond, Indiana, with a degree in biological sciences. She then continued on to get a master's in marine sciences at William & Mary, and then earned her PhD from Northeastern University in marine and environmental sciences. And as I mentioned, she's currently working here, getting additional training, getting additional experience as a postdoctoral scientist, working with Dr. Cliff Buck, who's here in the audience, watching her every move. No pressure. So tonight, I'd like to welcome Dr. Moore and take it away.
Thank you so much, Clark. Is my sound okay? Okay, great. So as you heard, my background is to some degree in marine sciences. However, I am branching out, pun somewhat intended, to look at some plants that grow up in the air, which is a new and exciting thing for me. So I'll talk a little bit about these familiar plants with some hidden talents. The Spanish moss and resurrection ferns and how they're part of the water cycle. So I'll talk about just some cool things about them and also some of the broader concepts of why we think they're important. And I'll delve into some research that we've recently done about these plants. So the plants we'll talk about today, which you have seen, I actually brought some examples here, which we can pass around again. But if you drove here, you've seen these plants, the Spanish moss and the resurrection ferns, growing on the oak trees. But there are a lot of plants like this that live on trees. So some plants called arboreal epiphytes, or arboreal meaning they're on trees, and epiphytes, epi meaning on, and phyte meaning plant. So they're plants that grow on trees. And they have a really unique lifestyle, and I think they're just fun to talk about. So you can see some here. They're really important in a lot of rainforests and cloud forests, and you can see there's a great diversity of them on trees in these areas. And I also included some temperate ones. You can see a little melting snow on these mosses over here. And they're cool plants for a lot of reasons, but I think that they have, to sort of understand what makes epiphytes special, I think we should back up and think about what we know about all plants. So what do all plants need? So we can think about how these types of plants might be different. Water, okay, that came really quickly. Sun, water, okay, anything else? Air. Yeah, sure, they need air. Yeah, some kind of nutrition. They need all these things. And so how do most plants get water? For the roots, right? Yeah, from the ground. Thank you for answering these questions and a little audience participation. Very good. I thought I was going to have to really try to get people to answer. I'm glad I didn't. So how do epiphytes get water? They don't have access to any water in the ground. So all of the water they get has to come from the air. So rainwater, or in the case, especially of some of the tropical plants, from mist or clouds. They can actually sort of drink the water from the air. So this is interesting in a few ways from the air. Oh, I put that there. This is interesting in a few ways because first of all, they're good. Whoops, here we go. So they're good. Epiphytes are really good at catching and storing rainwater. And this is because they have to be. They don't really have any choice of any other way to get water. And they have some cool things that they do to help them get water from the air. One is that they drink water through their leaves. Many of them do. So this is a cross-section of a leaf, and you can see they take in water through their little pores and cracks in the openings in their leaves. Another thing they do is a lot of them store water for later. So this little guy here is looks, at least to me, like a tank bromeliad, and that's one that you'll also see in this area. You can even see them in people's gardens where they can hold water in their center. And so a lot of these epiphytes also have ways of storing water. So what happens when it doesn't rain for these plants? Yeah, a lot of them might have a hard time. So they may be particularly vulnerable to drought because for these plants that don't have access to the soil, when it's not raining, when there's not enough moisture in the air, that can be a problem for them. So the epiphytes we'll talk about today, Spanish moss and resurrection fern. You can see here, this probably looks very familiar to many of you. It's right near Skidaway. And you can see the Spanish moss hangs down from the branches of the trees, and the resurrection ferns would grow on the top. Here's a little close-up of them. And I think of these as plants that are very familiar to us, but many of us don't know some of the really cool things that they can do. I even put the Latin names in case anybody wants to know that. So I'll tell you a little bit about them, starting with the resurrection fern. So the resurrection fern is so named because it's a resurrection plant. So there are other plants that are called resurrection plants as well. And it can go from this dried out leaves that are all curled up and they look very brown, to these green leaves, which are open and photosynthesizing. And that can happen just in a matter of hours, really. And so you can see, I've shown a picture that I actually found in a paper of the hydrated versus the dried leaves. And this is a picture I took just around here. And it's really striking how they look very brown, they look very dead, but they're far from it, really. The resurrection fern can lose about 95% of its water content, and it just allows itself to dry out, and it goes into a kind of stasis, like we would call it like a metabolic stasis, where it's not doing any of the plant things. It's not photosynthesizing, it's not respiring, it's just sort of asleep in a certain kind of way. And then when it goes into this into this state, it curls up so the back of the leaf is exposed, and that's actually what makes it look brown. If you were to unfurl this, you would see that the front of the leaf, or the top of the leaf, however you want to think of it, is still green in there, but it protects that green part with this brown part in the back. And I'll show you that brown part that is exposed when it's dried out is covered with little scales. So how does resurrection fern get back to normal hydration? It dries all the way out, and then basically as soon as you put water on it, it will start to rehydrate. So what happens is it'll take these. Is there a little pointer on here? No, it doesn't look like it. So this brown part here is actually little scales that cover the back, and they're brown, and that's why it looks brown, not because it's dead. And these scales help it to catch water, and then it drinks the water, it takes it in through its leaves. And so here is a picture of one of the scales, sort of like a little umbrella, and you can actually see, oops, there's a water droplet here caught underneath it. This is a little water droplet. And so it catches the water there, and it can take it into its little pores and drink it. And that's how the resurrection ferns can become rehydrated. And it's a pretty amazing ability. There are not that many plants that can just dry out completely and sort of die almost and then resurrect themselves. So I just think they're a fun plant to know about. And you can see here the nice, healthy, happy looking plants. And you can even see where this is, you can see this dark color of moss coming down here. You can see this is where the water comes down the tree. You can see that where the water drips down is where they'll be growing and thriving. So that's a little bit about the resurrection fern. And Spanish moss is our other really cool epiphyte that we have here. That's the one you probably would have noticed more because it's around everywhere.
Does humidity play a part in this process?
Well, I think that these plants like humidity, for sure. It benefits them to have a more moist environment. I don't think that people have done experiments on that, specifically, but I think for, at least in the tropics where people have studied a lot of a greater diversity of epiphytes, they've actually found a close correspondence between the vapor pressure deficit, how much water is sort of missing from the air. So how much water is in the air versus missing from the air, and the abundance and diversity of the epiphytes that live on the trees. That's in the tropics. Here, I mean, we don't have specific research on that, but I would say yes, they like they like water in the air. Okay, so Spanish moss. The joke about Spanish moss, if you're a person who tells jokes about plants, which apparently I am, is that it is neither. It is not Spanish, and it is also not a moss. The Spanish moss, or Tillandsia usnioides, is actually a bromeliad, like a lot of air plants. So it is much more closely related to a pineapple, which is in the same family, Bromeliaceae, than, say, a moss, which is a completely very, very different type of plant. So they're bromeliads, and one thing that I've learned about Spanish moss that surprised me is, in a way, they have some succulent characteristics. They're a little bit succulent leaning. They're kind of like a succulent, and they do actually store water in their leaves. So here, this is just a cross section of a Tillandsia leaf, which you can see it's round, like many succulents. Just saying. And they've stained it, so they've cut a cross section of the leaf and they've stained to show you water containing cells, these dark cells that are storing water. So unlike the ferns, which just give up all their water and go to sleep, Tillandsia, or Spanish moss, hangs on to its water and can store it in its leaves in some ways like a succulent does. But what does Spanish moss not have? If you look at it, if you've seen it, if you've looked at it, if you've observed it in all its glory, if you want, I still do have these. Anybody want to have a look? Close up of these plants? Pass them back? Okay. What do they not have? What do you not see in this plant? Roots, yes. We are talking about a plant here with no roots, which I just think is amazing. I think that's so cool. We have a plant with no roots growing here. We see it every day. And honestly, it wasn't until I started studying these plants, I didn't appreciate all these cool things about them. So how does it get the water? What does it do? No roots. Okay, no roots. I had to put it twice. So Spanish moss is kind of similar to the ferns. It's covered with these sort of plate-like scales. They're like sort of like little fans that cover the outside of it. And actually, if you look even with your most basic microscope, like the one that I have, that's like a toy one I use with my 5-year-old child, you can actually look and see that silvery color that you notice on the Spanish moss comes from all these little plates on the outside. They're called trichomes, but you don't need to know that. They're just cool little plates on the outside. So Spanish moss uses these little plates these plates or scales to move water along its outside and to take that water in. And so this is just a diagram from a paper. And all you really need to know is when they're dry, the edges sort of stick up. And then as the water comes down, it gets under this edge and they flatten out. And then what happens is, like a set of dominoes that falls down, each one knocking the next one, the water travels from plate to plate. And so as it comes to the next plate, it sticks that little arm of that plate down. As it comes to the next one, it does that. And so in that way, in this domino-like movement, it actually moves water all along its outside using these scales outside of it. And then it channels the water into where it can drink it through its leaves in the pores that all plants have in their leaves. It can take in water that way, and through any little crack, I think, where it could get in. So I think something interesting to know about these plants is that, we see them every day. We don't maybe think too much about what they are, what they do, but they have these really cool characteristics, these cool adaptations to this life up in the canopy. Okay, let's see, what am I going to talk about next? So why should you care about epiphytes? Obviously, I care about them because I think they're cool. I'm a biologist. I care about any fun thing I get to learn about. I mean, that's the fun of doing what I do, right? But why should you care about epiphytes? Well, one reason is that epiphytes capture and store rainwater in the canopy. We've just learned and talked about how they're very good at getting water because they have to be. And for that reason, they are really important in catching water and holding it in the canopy and influencing that environment. Partly it's because they have these great adaptations, but they're also just adding a lot more surface area to the canopy itself. If you think about, if you had this branch just bare, this is just an oak tree, if you had this branch just bare, it would have a lot less surface area of leaves on it versus all this stuff hanging down. These are the resurrection ferns growing on top. So you're just adding more area for water to stick to is part of it. And so why do we care that water is sticking to the canopy? I'll zoom out for a minute to just the broader idea of the water cycle, which I won't trouble you with the vast details of it, but we all learned at some point in elementary school how water, evaporates up into the air, clouds are formed, it rains, the water runs off, goes into water bodies, etc. And these are really important functions on our planet that affect the climate and, how much rain we have and all these very important things. So this is really essential global scale functioning that forests have a really important role in. So right here, you can see this arrow, which I stuck a yellow one on there, is well, they're calling it evapotranspiration here. And that's the water that comes out, that evaporates out of the forest. And so that can be the water that just falls on the leaves and then evaporates. And it also incorporates the transpiration, which is just the process that all plants do of losing water through the little pores in their leaves, just through their normal respiration and photosynthesis. And yeah, so I won't get into all the nitty-gritty of that, but this is part of this global scale important process that we need water coming into the air from these forests. So forests are a really critical part in the global water cycle, that pull water from the ground or, take water from the rain and then release it back into the atmosphere. This is just a photograph of a tropical forest, and this is just showing all of the sort of clouds of water that are coming up off the forest. And so forests are a really critical part of this. And the moisture that is produced by the world's forests can, generate rainfalls thousands of miles away and things like that. So, on every day we pass by Spanish moss and the resurrection ferns and our oaks, we don't necessarily think about this big scale process that they're participating in. All right, so we know epiphytes capture and store rainwater in the canopy. So just to diagram this out a little bit, you have your precipitation falling down. Then the epiphytes are capturing a lot of that water, some of that water. And that means more water is getting stored in the canopy. So it's in or on the plant leaves to be, potentially evaporated later. So that leads to evaporation. And evaporation, as we know, because we live in the South where it's hot, when you sweat, you get cool, right? Evaporation has a cooling effect. And participating, is an important aspect of cloud formation, as I mentioned. And so that's actually something, that then is creating a feedback, that evaporation is important for cloud formation, which is then going to be important for more rainfall. So just diagram that out with our plants. And so one thing that we were interested in the research we're doing, which I'll get into now, was how drought might affect this. So the predictions for the area where we live are that as climate change continues to progress, we'll actually have more dry periods in the spring and summer, which is also when it's hot. So not great to be dry and hot. But since increasing drought is anticipated with climate change, we were interested in how the effect of drought on the plants themselves might influence this big scale role that they have in storing water, that's part of this and more important cycling. So in thinking about this, okay, so if we have precipitation following drought, then we're going to have the water falling on dry leaves. So maybe that's different in some way from the water falling on, hydrated, happy leaves. So we hypothesized that there might actually be, that leaves might actually capture less water when they're dry, which may seem counterintuitive, but I'll get into a little bit more in a minute. So in that case, we would have less water storage, lower evaporation. So it's really this aspect. We've not measured, the evaporation, but we're specifically interested in this sort of part of the diagram. So do dry leaves capture less water, leading to less storage and potentially evaporation in the canopy? So now I'll talk a little bit about the specific research project that I've recently published on these epiphytes that's caused me to learn so much about them. And what we're really interested in, as I've said, is does drought decrease the epiphyte water storage in the canopy, right? And so specifically, we wanted to know, can dry leaves hold as much water as hydrated leaves? So when the plant itself is under stress and going through a state of being dried out, it may be the case that it's not able to absorb the water as well as it might otherwise do. And to kind of get at why this, how the water might be leaving the leaves or why they would not be capturing as much water, we also wanted to know, are the leaves more hydrophobic, is what we call it? Does the water roll off of them more easily once they're dry? And then we're also interested in comparing these two species a little bit. So will drought affect the water storage more in Spanish moss versus resurrection fern? Obviously, you've seen they're different plants in many ways. They have some real similarities, but they also have some big differences. And so, one thing I wondered about is, could it be that one can sort of be an insurance policy for the other one? Let's say one of them doesn't hold up too well under dry conditions, but maybe the other one does. So in the end, it would be able to fill in for the one that doesn't, if that makes sense. So we wanted to compare the two species as well. Okay, so I'm a little nervous getting into the more in-depth science, and if anything's not clear, you shouldn't hesitate to raise your hand too, because I'm perfectly happy to stop and explain things more. Okay, so how did we test these questions that I'm talking about? Testing the drought effects on water storage in the plant leaves. So we took a sample of plant leaf from either species, which we standardized by the weight of it. So we weighed out a certain amount. And then we put it through different drought treatments, essentially of drying it out. So you have 100% of hydrated mass. So those are the happy leaves. Then you have dried down to 75%, 50%, and approximately 25% of the normal hydrated mass. And then we measured how well does water stick to these leaves, essentially. And we did that at each hydration level. Oh, look, I had arrows to myself there. Okay, so how do you measure water sticking on the leaves? The way we did it is you hang the leaf in a little fog box. I made this little cartoon for us. But you have these plexiglass fog boxes. And they're clear plastic boxes with a misting system inside that delicately mists water at the plants. And you hang the plant of known mass from a little filament that has connected to a load cell that weighs it. So you're essentially weighing it hanging. Like, I don't know, like you can do with fish. I don't know if you've ever weighed fish on a... Right, and so then over time you see how the water accumulates, how the mass changes, and you can, once that weight stabilizes, it's collected about as much water as it's going to, and you can measure the difference in weight, and that's how we know how much water has stuck to the plant leaves. So yes, this is what I just said, and so we repeated this at each hydration level for both of these plants. Oh, I had an arrow for myself again. Gotta look out for these arrows. They're supposed to help me. All right, so, and this is an example. These are not the fog boxes that we used, but they're just from another science lab that I was able to find some pictures where you can see sort of how it operates, where you would hang the plant and you sort of mist delicately so that it accumulates water. Okay, so what happened to the leaves in the fog boxes? Does drought decrease epiphyte water storage? So this was our sort of first question that I talked about. Can dry leaves hold as much water as hydrated leaves? Okay, so now I'll show you some data. So just to walk you through this, what I'm showing here is, I've got the Latin names in here. I actually didn't think to change that, but fortunately I also included cartoons. So you can tell we've got the fern here and the Spanish moss here. And what I'm showing here on the bottom is the drought treatment. So how dried out was it? So 25%, it was dried out to 25% of its fresh weight. So that's our driest treatment, our driest set of leaves there. 50, 75, and 100% are the ones that were at a healthy hydration level. Then I have the same thing over here. So each of these bars represents the amount of water storage, so that mass of water, which we measured in grams, that we were able to determine for each of these hydration levels. And these are box and whisker plots. They're basically showing you the median, which is something similar to a mean. It's what we use a lot when we talk about income, for example, because it's a good measure, well, for lots of things, but it's robust to outliers, and it's a nice way to measure sort of the middle value of a set of numbers. And then these are just the quartiles. So they show you the spread of the data points. So I've showed each individual data point and then the median there and the quartiles of sort of the 25% intervals of how the data is distributed. That may be more information than you need, but I hate for people to sit and look at a figure and think, what is this? What is this showing? So in any case, so as you can see, the lower hydration level, so the more dried out leaves for both of these plants had lower levels of water storage. So these bars are lower than these, and the ones that were different based on our statistics have different letters. So you can see B was different from A. So the fully hydrated was different from the lowest level, the dried out leaves. Okay, so we're finding out that for both these species, you know, a slightly different pattern here, but we see that when they're dried out, they do not hold as much water. Okay, getting some answers. You don't always get answers in science, but it is what we want so much. We work so hard to get answers in science. Okay, so can these leaves hold as much water as hydrated leaves? No, as far as we can tell, they cannot. Okay, we answered one question. So the water storage is lower when leaves are dry, but why would this be the case? What's going on with the leaf that's making the water not stick to it? So we get to our second question. Does water roll off the leaves more? And when I say roll off, I'm talking about sort of their, what we call hydrophobicity. Whoops, here we go, number 2. So this is sort of what we thought, is that the hydrated leaves would hang on to their water more, and the dry leaves might have the water sort of rolling off of them more, which again, I've shown in some friendly little cartoons here. So we thought that the water might be more likely to roll off of the leaves because drying can sort of change the leaf surface. Now, a leaf, we kind of think of the leaf surface as just being flat, but actually it's not. If you zoom in close and you look at the cuticle of the leaf, the surface part, just like our skin for the leaf, it's actually like a little mountain range in there, all kinds of ridges, all kinds of things going on. And that sort of texture of the leaf contributes to what we call hydrophobicity. So hydrophobicity is, if you think about the word, just, so hydro meaning water, phobicity meaning, you know, well, we think of, you know, arachnophobia is the fear of spiders. Hydrophobicity is sort of a repelling of water, right? And so, as I mentioned, if you have the leaf surface, so this is showing the cross-section of the leaf. So if you were to slice a piece of this and look at what it looks like inside, you know, there are cells, obviously. And then on the outside, you have this, what they call the cuticle with all these little waxy bits. So like little ridges of wax and things sticking up. And that wax can actually repel the water, and the water droplets can sort of stand on the outer surface of the leaf, sort of like a ball, you know, a ping pong ball sitting on a cone. And, you know, every leaf is very different. Some leaves are very hydrophobic, others are not. But we thought that some of the changes, when leaves go through drought, they're going through a different level of stress, and that can change that sort of surface of the leaf and make it look different, give it a different sort of topography, if you will. So we hypothesized that this might actually make the water roll off more easily when they're under that stress from drought. Another way so how do we measure this? We can measure the hydrophobicity of the leaves by actually looking at droplets on the leaf. So how we did this in our study was to put droplets of water on the leaf and then using a camera and imaging software to measure the angle at which the droplet is coming into contact with the leaf. So it is, so we can look at how this droplet is sort of touching the leaf. So if you look at these, which one do you think, A, B, C, D, E, which one do you think is more likely to roll off the plant leaf? A, right? Yeah, and that's sort of intuitive. It's standing up. It looks like it wants to roll, right? Whereas E, you can see, may actually be sinking into the plant leaf. Yeah, so A. And so the way we measure this, the contact angle of the water droplet, we measure it in degrees, just as you might think of a 90-degree angle or any sort of geometry that we might have rattling around in our minds from I don't know when the last time was I took geometry. High school, honestly, maybe for me. But it sticks with you. So you measure this little angle and you can see this droplet sort of, it looks more like D, right? This one's kind of flattened out a little bit on the leaf surface, and you can see it has a smaller angle here if you were to measure it compared to this guy. I would say this guy looks sort of like B to me, is standing up a lot more. So this is going to have a bigger angle. So you just have a bigger number when you measure the angle. Which brings us to the measurements we did with hydrophobicity. So, so here I'm showing the exact same types of figures across our dehydration levels, so the driest one to the wettest leaves. And we're showing that degree angle of hydrophobicity. So we know a larger number is that droplet that's standing up nice and tall, ready to roll off, right? And so what you can see here is that in the more dry leaves, they're more hydrophobic. So that's a greater level of hydrophobicity, and that was true for both species. And this is interesting, and we don't actually know the specific mechanism of why this is happening, but we do know that when the plant leaves are stressed, their surface may be changing in different ways. There's all kinds of changes that go on, just like when your skin gets dry and it might start to crack, or at least mine does, start to like crack, or, so we think those changes are leading to this increase in hydrophobicity. So that gives us an idea of why we're having less water storage. The water is kind of rolling off these stressed out leaves. Okay, so, Okay, so we've answered 2 questions as best we can so far. Can leaves hold water? Can the dry leaves hold as much water? No. Does water roll off the leaves more? Yes. The dry leaves more? Yes, it does, compared to the fully hydrated leaves. So that leads us to our last question. So we know that this may be an issue with drought. There's maybe less water being stored in the canopy. We want to know, will the overall decrease in water in the canopy be different between these 2 species? Maybe one is still maintaining much more of that storage versus the other. So to look at that, I actually looked at, I compared them in terms of the % change in water storage. We have called that S max. It's just a hydrological term. Don't need to worry about it. But so what I looked at was the % change in water storage when you go from the most to the least hydrated. So I just calculated that. So if you were to look at that % change over that dehydration, when you get to your most dehydrated level, how much of a decrease would that be? So that's what we're showing here for the fern and the Spanish moss. And so the 0 line would be no change here. And what we can see is there are pretty big reductions, sort of percent reductions in the overall water storage for both species, up to 50% in many cases, which is a lot of water. I mean, I think the first take home from this is that's a lot of water storage being lost. Because if you scale that up to the whole forest or the whole region, that's a lot of water that would not be getting evaporated, right, otherwise. And then the other thing that stands out is you notice there are no different letters on top of these bars telling us they're different because at least statistically they're not different. So the overall percentage of the water storage that's being lost when you dry the leaves out is not really different between the two species. So what that tells me is that we can't necessarily count on one to be filling in for the other. So this is something we think about in biology and ecology is, when you have multiple species doing a similar role, if one is, more easily stressed out, there might be another one that can kind of stand up and take their place, right? So we want that comparison of species to know if they can sort of fill in for each other. And based on this, I would say, they're both going to experience a similar decrease in overall water storage, if they're under drought conditions. So I think those are two of the big take-homes from that. Okay, so we have actually answered some questions, what we always want to do in science. So the dry leaves don't hold as much water. The water rolls off the leaves. And the overall decrease in water storage, the amount of water that can cling to the leaves, is pretty similar for both species. Okay, what was I going to talk about next? What more is there to say? Oh, yes. So to sum this up, when we think back about what these plants are doing and why we care, apart from the fact that they're really cool, and I hope you go home and think like, wow, I'm so glad I know more about Spanish moss because it's just the coolest plant. I can't believe those resurrection ferns. Like, can you believe you put water on them, they just come back to life? What is that all about? So you definitely be thinking that tonight. But additionally, on this broad scale, when we have precipitation following drought, it's falling on dry leaves, right? The leaves, as we've shown, in our lab experiments, these leaves might actually capture less water. And that would actually lead to less water storage overall in the canopy, which could also decrease evaporation. So that has the potential to feed back on these much broader hydrological systems and climate systems that, that we care about due to the importance of that, of the evaporation from forest canopies. Okay, had to show that one more time. So I think that's the big take home in many ways is that, not only are these plants really cool, but they also participate in these broad processes. So don't ever think that whatever little plant you see growing in the cracks or up in the tree isn't important because it may be important for something that we just, don't know about yet or haven't heard about. So yeah, I wanted to thank the people who were involved in this research, in particular my co-authors. Sybil Gosh was our co-author who works in these canopy systems, climbs the trees, and she was sort of the driving force in coming up with these really cool ideas to test about these species. And she had 3 really fantastic students, Jelena, Laura, and Anne, who helped collect the data and did a lot of this work in the lab, undergraduate students, under her mentorship, which was amazing. And then we also had another co-author, John Van Stan, who helped with the paper, and my boss, Cliff Buck, who has obviously supported and mentored me as I've learned about this research and contributed to the research as well. Additionally, there were various people at Skidaway, who helped with the research and helped make this possible, and various institutions I've shown at the bottom that have helped to support the research through their institutional resources, as well as, of course, the National Science Foundation funded the research. So I have to give my acknowledgements to all these very important people and institutions. And I'll leave you with a little diagram. This is actually, so this has now been published in a journal called Science of the Total Environment, which I always think is funny, the total environment. But it makes sense in this case. We're thinking about these broad processes. We're thinking about the total environment, right? And this was our graphical abstract for the paper that kind of shows in sum what the main things that we found. So I can leave you with that to mull over. Yep, that's. And I'm happy to discuss anything. There's so much more that you could talk about. You might be tired of hearing about these plants, but I never get tired of talking about them. So there may be other things that are percolating in your minds. Yes.
Question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
When you did your misting experiments on the 4 different levels of dehydrated leaves, I'm assuming that they were all done at the same time frame, elapsed time. They were all misted at the same.
Yeah, for the same length of time. Yeah, so how those trials work is that, so you hang the plants up in there. Obviously, you do it at various times for many, many ones to measure. But what we found is that after about 15 minutes, they've accumulated as much water as they're going to, and you could run the trial much, much, much longer without seeing really any appreciable change in the amount. So it's sort of 15-ish minutes is how long it takes for them to get as much water as they're going to.
Did you ever try to extend it? Like what I'm trying to say is on a 25% hydrated leaf, you missed it until it got to 50%, and then see if it had the same characteristics going forward.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So would a leaf that had previously been dried be able to sort of be able to recover? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that we didn't do it in that way because it was more controlled to do it in the way that we have, where you're going down. So when we measured things on the same leaf, you would do it at the highest level and then go down from there, so that you're not sort of confounding it with the condition of the leaf having been further dried previously. I would say that that's an interesting question and one that could be tested. In my mind, for the ferns, they get dried out all the time. I would actually say their dry state is almost the more normal state. I think in one of these slides I had normal in quotes for them. Normal hydration, like what is normal hydration for a plant that dries all the way out if it doesn't rain for a couple weeks, So I think for the ferns, it's very common for them to be all the way dried out. And so that might be their more common state for them to be reacting to water in the way that we've shown for the more dried out leaves. For the Spanish moss, I would say that it's actually very hard to dry it out. It holds on to its water and it does not want to let go. And so you have to dry it and dry it and dry it to get it to lose enough water to even get to the treatments that we wanted to do. And so I think for that plant, when you think about drying it all the way down to 25% of its fresh weight, we would say, or like fully hydrated weight, that would, to me, would constitute a significant level of stress for that plant. And I actually have another sidebar, but I have another set of experiments that I've just recently done looking at that for the Spanish moss, like tormenting it with, sort of a hot flash combined with a drought and getting it to lose a bunch of water and seeing, how it's, how that affects it on a sort of physiological level. So more forthcoming on that.
Okay.
My question actually is in the same general area. So you've clearly shown us that there's a difference in the way water storage will behave and how much this ecosystem can store when they're drought stressed and when they dry out. But underlying it is an assumption that once that's passed, then we all go back to the same situation we were in, at least temporarily. And the concern we have, of course, is the more you have drought, the longer it lasts, and the more severe it is, the more change in the canopy. So my question is, it seems like one of the things that you might extend from this research going forward would be this other kind of stress you started to talk about, which is what kind of drought situation might we expect to find in the Southeast in terms of either intensity or duration, And if we expose both of these species to more intense drought, longer drought, or really intense and long drought, where do we reach a point where maybe they can't come back to the level of function that we had in this ecosystem in the first place?
Sure.
You know, are we way far away from that? Are we close to that? I mean, I know those are different questions, different experiments, but it seems to me that'd be really important.
Yeah, so I do think that's interesting. I mean, it's something I've written about and thought about as well. If you were, I mean, obviously this work is at more the scale of the leaf and what's going on physiologically with the plant on that leaf. And I think, you know, part of what's cool about the work is that it's connecting the level of the leaf, that, you know, that small structure and response to these broader processes. So I think that that's an important element, but I also think, especially since my background's more in ecology than it is plant physiology, I think it more, you know, how many plants would, say, survive over time, or what would be their loss in their photosynthetic ability after they withstood a drought for X period of time, and that sort of thing. And that's something that I'll be able to get at, you know, somewhat with some of this, the further extensions of this work that I've been doing. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see sort of how, at least, you know, for Spanish moss, how it would respond to simulated drought stress and weather and heat, and whether it can still sort of photosynthesize after it's been through that. So yeah, that'll be interesting to get into more, and looking at it at a broader scale. I mean, I think there are a lot of extensions you could do from this work, but thinking, you know, if you were to look at sort of this broader scale of the canopy and how the plants would respond over time if you could simulate drought, I think would be really interesting work. I don't have immediate plans to do it, but you know, I think, yeah, it would be really interesting work to do, and I have some ideas along those lines. Yeah.
We have another question in the back.
Oh, sorry.
Do you have an idea how long that resurrection fern can stay in that dry ground before it would actually really die?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We don't know that, but I think a couple things. So I have an idea of what I think the plant might do, but nobody has really tested this. One thing about the plant is that it has, so the ferns do have roots, and they have what you call a rhizome, where it's a long, you know, big sort of root-like structure. Well, small in these plants, but it's sort of a structure that connects the different fronds. And the ones that are connected are all one individual. They're one plant, even though they might span a long distance. And so these plants have those, what we call rhizomes, that have roots coming down from them. And so one plant that's one individual, like you or me, might be growing over a larger area, right? And over that area, that individual might, for example, be experiencing, you know, getting some more water over here. Like I showed that picture of the oak tree where the water's coming down, you can see the plants are flourishing. So there might be part of that individual that's getting more water over here versus over there, and able to continue even though the leaves are stressed on that other part, if that makes sense. And you will notice a lot that that the ferns drop their leaves. So if you walk around, you'll see them on the ground. And I suspect that that rhizome, so that individual, may live a long, long time, but that when an individual leaf gets too damaged, it might just drop that leaf, which is something plants can do, which is wild. Plants are so different from us, and that's why I think they're so cool, you know? So yeah, that's what I think they may do. You know, we don't know, no one's tested that. But given that these plants have been around for a long time, obviously they go through a lot of drought stress. And I think that death probably occurs more often at the level of the leaf. Get rid of that leaf that's not good anymore, keep growing a new one. But we've not tested it, just, yeah.
How do both of them get planted?
How do they get planted?
How
Oh
do
yeah.
they get up there?
So I think they're both wind dispersed. I mean, so the fern is a fern, and ferns have sort of complex life cycles that I would have to review in a textbook if I really wanted to give you all the details. However, if you look at the back of the leaf, they have those what are called the sorus, which is where all the little spores are. And they have a bunch of the little dots. That's part of what looks brown on the back of the leaf. And those are all the spores. And so they release spores, and those spores land places and grow little fernlets. And you can actually look, if you look in the bark, sometimes you'll see like a new little fern that's not connected to any other roots anywhere. So those spores kind of land wherever it's good for them and grow. And for the Spanish moss, it's a flowering plant. And so it does make little flowers. They're sort of like tufty little guys. You can tell they disperse by the wind because they have a little fluff on them. And so you can actually see them blowing around, and they'll, land. You'll see them land in clumps, in festoons of tillandsia. I can't believe I forgot to mention this, but the technical term for one of those hanging down things of Spanish moss is a festoon. So the individual festoons, we don't know how many individuals they're made up of, or there's a lot we don't know about them. But you'll see the little flowers on those leaves and festoons, and then you'll see them getting blown around. So they just land wherever they can live up in the tree.
One of the questions,
Yeah.
if a big festoon falls down,
Yeah, they do.
massive, is that the end of its life?
Yes. Yeah. And people have looked at that actually. So if you take the Spanish moss needs the tree. It needs a tree. It needs a host. It's an obligate, epiphyte. It can't live on the ground. So if they fall on the ground, if they're on the ground for a long time, they will eventually die. They're also, I think the work that's looked at that also showed that they're kind of adding organic matter and like nutrients to the ground where they fall. So they're kind of part of the cycle of life. Yeah.
Does Spanish moss photosynthesize at all?
Yeah, so all plants have to photosynthesize, and it looks, so what's weird about Spanish moss and why I think you would ask that question is that it looks really silvery. It doesn't look very green. But again, if you look at it, that white appearance is all the little scales on the outside. And if you rub those off, it's green under there. So yeah, I mean, like all plants, it's getting nutrients from the sunlight, just like all, everything from mosses to algae to flowering plants have to do that. With the rare exception of a few parasites that we won't complicate, but yeah, they have to be doing that. And I think they do, even when they're stressed by drought, they're still photosynthesizing. But the ferns do kind of pause that when they're all dried out.
Do orchids have anything in common with these plants?
I would say there are many orchids that are epiphytic, or there are some epiphytes that are orchids. So yeah, I mean, they have a similar lifestyle in that regard. I don't know as much about the orchids biology, but I know that there are many epiphytic orchids that probably have some similar dynamics in terms of their, water needs and storage. Anything else? Quiz me.
Try to.
Well, we don't have any questions online, so if those are all the questions we have from the audience here, let's thank Dr. Moore again with a round of applause.
Thank you so much for coming and giving me the opportunity to talk about these cool plants. And again, I hope you go home and think about how awesome they are.
Yeah.